Ultimately I think Buckley must be right, because I've never heard anyone complain. Buckley starts off his argument with a description of a train ride he took where everyone was hot and no one would say anything. And the cause of this, according to Buckley? Wimpishness. Do you buy it? The author of this piece, William F. Buckley, this is him, notice he doesn't really seem to have a chin in this photo, is what at the time would have been called a right-wing conservative commentator. Well, that was what you would call him in the 70s and 80s. What right-wing conservatism is nowadays is a lot different than it was then. Different conversation, though. And he was obsessed with, at least in this article, complaining. People who complain. I know you've seen them all the time. If you've ever worked restaurant industry, you've probably experienced this. If you've ever worked at a grocery store, I'm sure you've experienced this. People who tend to want to moan and whine about absolutely everything. I think in another video I mentioned the guy who jumped over the counter and threatened to knife me because his pizza was a few minutes late. Another memorable complainer was a guy who yelled at me for 5 minutes in the store, left, came back, yelled at me for 5 more minutes, hung up on me. Called me back, yelled at me for 5 more minutes. The whole time I'm trying to get his phone number so I can have my supervisor talk to him, because I don't want to deal with him anymore, but he hangs up on me, and then calls back a third time and yells at me for 5 minutes. I finally get his phone number and give it to my supervisor, and it turns out my supervisor called me back and he's like, Mike, what was that guy's problem originally? I'm like, he was mad because he didn't get an itemized receipt. And he's like, he didn't mention anything about that. He just talked about how rude you were. I'm like, what would really prompt somebody to spend 20 minutes of their day yelling over a receipt? Clearly, it didn't have anything to do with the receipt. There must have been something else going on in his life. And when we talked about Barbara Ehrenreich, we talked about how people tend to take out their aggressions on the people who serve them. If we didn't, we should have. And I think that's a lot of what was happening with this guy. However, for Buckley, it's something more fundamental. It's our right as an American to complain. And if we don't complain, it's a sign that we just don't care. We don't want to take the responsibility. We don't want to stand out. Someone else will probably take care of it. And this is the bystander effect. Some people think of it as a logical fallacy. It was based on a New York Times story about someone who supposedly was raped and beaten up outside her apartment and none of the neighbors did anything. Well, it turns out that the story is false, and a neighbor did come down to help her almost immediately and call the cops. But it doesn't make as good of a story, does it? Anyway, back to Buckley and complaining. What he said: when our voices are finally mute, when we have finally suppressed the natural instinct to complain, whether the vexation is trivial or grave, we shall become automatons, incapable of feeling. Now, we could go on about his complaining and how he complained, and why he would put the bit about complaining in the ski repair place, only to find out that the guy who wasn't helping him had a heart attack. Why did he put that in? It seems to undermine his case. But I want to talk about some of the ramifications. One of the things that Buckley brought up was that he thought the reason we didn't complain was due to politics and technology. Yeah, I know. His exact quote, "Our increased sense of helplessness in an age of technology and centralized political and economic power." And technology has made us less likely to complain. I don't know if he would say the same thing nowadays, and if he did, it's because he'd never been on Facebook or in the YouTube comment section. The idea that we don't complain because we have a large government, as I said, he was a right-wing conservative at the time. What I want to focus on for a little bit is the idea of complaining having a relationship to power. That complaining gives us power, and if we don't complain, we don't have power. If we just try to get along, then we're letting our power go. If we state our case and argue, we become tough and powerful. And he does specifically tie this power to masculinity in the piece. So I want to explore that a little bit. Isn't masculine to complain? Is it a sign of your macho-ness if you are not emotional, if you stand up for yourself? The idea that standing up for yourself and complaining are signs that you're not emotional is a bit weird, but we might get into that later. How does this version of masculinity lie out? If you're tough and assertive, you're masculine. Well, let's see how this works in the real world. Man candles. Yeah, candles for men. Because apparently if you have a candle that is named after a flower or an herb or something, you're feminine. Toothpaste for men. I have problems understanding this one as well. But the idea is that it's really powerful. It's for men. Powerful stain removal. Power peppermint. Power peppermint, really? CVS, men's mesh sponge with grip cord, as opposed to a cleaning bath poof. It's masculine if it has a grip cord. And the color helps too, I guess. Cereal. The idea that the gendering and the power come into play for things like cereal and kids is a little bit interesting. Boys have to have pirate cereal. Girls have to have princess cereal. Why? Pirates go out and do stuff. They conquer things. Princesses wait to be captured. Plus, from what I can see of the box, it also looks like boys are more attracted to artificial colors. But that's neither here nor there. Chap Fix Plus. Lip balm engineered for men. Lies flat in pocket. You wouldn't want anyone to see that you're wearing lip balm, would you? It would make you non-masculine. Next thing you know, you'd never complain about anything. Man Flu. This is an instant soup mix. It's Man Flu, the company for men that matter. Because actually cooking would make you look like a girl. Yeah, it's a little bit strange. The term that gets tossed around is toxic masculinity, the idea that things that aren't masculine is so dangerous to you as a guy that even the appearance of taking part in something that isn't fully masculine needs to be avoided because you don't want to look weak. Emotions? You don't cry. You go out and you do something. As far as you complain because you're showing your strength, well, Dale Carnegie in How to Make Friends and Influence People wrote, don't criticize, condemn, or complain. He wasn't worried about being masculine. He thought that it was a sign that you were being whiny. And in my research for this, I have to tell you that one of the downsides of doing these videos is I end up researching some topics that point me towards sources which are just kind of disturbing and awful. And this particular source I found on a website by some guy named Lane Goodwin, 21 Ways to Stop Being Effeminate Modern Man and Be More Masculine. Yeah, I know. His take on complaining and masculinity is that masculine men don't complain. Complaining is a purely feminine strategy employed by low-quality women to get what they want out of life. If a woman complains and nags for a long enough time, people might eventually cave and give her what she wants. Although it works from time to time, complaining is an inferior strategy even for a woman. Yeah. Now, this is one of the lighter quotes on this guy's webpage. Unless you want to be sickened, I wouldn't go to it. But the idea that complaining is you asserting your power, which is what Buckley said, is one that isn't even agreed upon by other right-wingers. I think the most interesting thing about it is if you're trying to get along, if you're trying to connect with other people, if you're trying to do something good, to care, it's not masculine. Good God. Is that really who we want to be? Is being considerate and not wanting to insult someone really not masculine? And do we want to live in a world that's like that? In case you're wondering, this is our moment for the video. Of course, we have to end with a little bit of context here. Buckley wrote Why Don't We Complain in 1960, at least that was when it was published. And we gotta admit that here in 2020, the world is a little bit of a different place. And the question has to be, do his arguments hold up? Or did they ever, really? But what about the context of the time makes it different from now? Do we have a shortage of people complaining right now? I kind of don't think so. But does that mean we're a more macho age? I don't even know what macho means in this particular case. And as we saw in our discussion, it can mean any number of very weird things. So, ultimately, how much are they tied? It's up to you, I guess. See you next video.